Am I the asshole for getting child support for more children than I had at home? I genuinely didn't think I was doing anything wrong at the time. That's what makes this whole situation so strange to me now. Because legally, I know I didn't do anything improper. I already checked that years ago with actual attorneys. But morally? Apparently, people have very strong opinions once they hear the full story. And honestly, after hearing enough people call me manipulative, greedy, unethical, or outright fraudulent, I've started wondering whether I accidentally became the villain in a situation that felt completely straightforward while I was living through it. So here's what happened. My ex-husband and I divorced when our 4 children were still minors. The divorce itself wasn't especially dramatic. Obviously, it was painful emotionally, but compared to a lot of divorces, ours was surprisingly civil. No screaming court battles, no custody warfare, no trying to destroy each other financially. By the time the marriage ended, we were honestly better co-parents than spouses. We shared custody reasonably well, communicated regularly, attended school events together when necessary, and generally tried to keep the children out of the conflict as much as possible. Part of why things stayed relatively smooth was because both of us were practical people. We understood that no matter how the marriage ended, we were still tied together through 4 children. And honestly, I think both of us were too exhausted by the end of the relationship to fight more than necessary. During the divorce proceedings, child support was established for all 4 children. Nothing unusual there. The court calculated the amount based on his income, the custody arrangement, and the fact that the kids primarily lived with me. At the time, the attorneys explained something very important to both of us. In our state, child support does not automatically decrease when a child turns 18. A lot of people apparently assume it does. It doesn't. You actually have to file paperwork with family court requesting the reduction. It's not difficult. You pay a small filing fee, submit the proper forms, and the amount gets recalculated based on however many minor children remain eligible. The attorneys explained all of this very clearly to both of us, and because I was working as a paralegal for a state office at the time, I was already familiar with filing legal paperwork, so we made a simple agreement. As each child aged out of child support eligibility, one of us would handle filing the reduction paperwork. I agreed to take care of the first one. Then he would handle the second. Then we'd basically alternate from there. Simple. At least, it seems simple. Years passed. Our oldest child eventually turned 18. Right on schedule, I filed the paperwork with the court. The support amount was reduced from covering 4 children to covering 3. Easy. No drama, no conflict. Everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Then, eventually, our second child turned 18, and this is where things started getting strange. I expected one of 2 things to happen. Either my ex-husband would reach out and ask how to file the paperwork, or the child support amount would suddenly decrease because he had already done it himself. Neither happened. At first, I honestly assumed he was just busy. Life happens. People procrastinate. I figured eventually he'd bring it up. But weeks passed. Then months. Nothing. And honestly, because we still communicated regularly about the children, it wasn't like he disappeared off the face of the earth. We talked often. School stuff, schedules, birthdays, normal co-parenting conversations. But somehow the support issue never came up. And I never brought it up either. That's the part people seem to judge me hardest for. At the time, though, my reasoning felt incredibly straightforward. He was a grown man. He had been sitting right there during the divorce discussions. He heard the attorneys explain the process exactly like I did. He specifically agreed to handle the next filing. And importantly, this wasn't hidden information. He knew our child had turned 18. He knew the amount hadn't changed. He had every opportunity to act. And honestly, part of me assumed maybe he intentionally wasn't bothering because financially he was doing well enough that it didn't matter much to him. So I stayed quiet. Then our third child turned 18. And unbelievably, the exact same thing happened again. No filing, no conversation, no questions, nothing. At that point, the situation honestly started feeling surreal, because now I technically had only one minor child at home while still receiving child support calculated for three. And yes, obviously I noticed. I'm not pretending I somehow missed it. Of course I knew. But again, I also knew he had every ability and legal responsibility to address it himself. And maybe this sounds cold, but after a while it stopped feeling like my responsibility to manage his finances for him. Especially because our divorce agreement had already divided responsibilities clearly. I handled the first filing. He was supposed to handle the second. He simply never did. What complicates everything emotionally is that we actually maintained a pretty good relationship throughout those years. No hostility, no fighting, no dramatic confrontations. We attended graduations together, helped kids move into apartments, talked about careers and college and family stuff. From the outside, we probably looked like one of those unusually functional divorce couples, which honestly makes people even more confused when they hear I stayed silent about the support issue. Because they imagine, if you were on good terms, why wouldn't you remind him? And honestly, I've asked myself that question a lot lately. At the time, though, I think my thinking became influenced by something subtle that's hard to explain unless you've gone through divorce. After years of marriage, and especially after divorce, you eventually become very aware of emotional labor, specifically who handles what. And throughout our marriage, I had often been the one remembering things, managing paperwork, tracking deadlines, organizing responsibilities, reminding him of appointments, handling details. And after the divorce, part of me quietly decided I no longer wanted to manage his responsibilities too. He was perfectly capable of filing a simple court document. If he chose not to, that was his decision. At least, that's how I rationalized it. And honestly, because he never once complained about the payments, I eventually stopped thinking about it much altogether. Life moved on. Kids became adults. One moved out. Another got married. Another graduated college. Years passed surprisingly quickly. Then eventually, our youngest child turned 18 and prepared to graduate high school. That's when my ex-husband finally brought me paperwork ending the support payments entirely. I signed immediately. No argument, no hesitation. Honestly, I was happy to finally close that chapter completely. Then his girlfriend made a comment that completely changed how I viewed the entire situation. She looked shocked and said something like, "Wait, I just found out he's been overpaying child support for years." Then she turned to me and said, "You knew and said nothing?" And suddenly I realized she viewed the situation completely differently than I did. To her, I wasn't just someone who stayed quiet while a legal process went unfinished. I was someone who knowingly accepted extra money for years while understanding exactly why it was happening. And honestly, when she phrased it that way, I suddenly sounded terrible. She kept going. "You knew how to file the documents. You worked as a paralegal. You knew he was paying for 3 kids when only one was still under 18. Everything she said was technically true. And yet, at the same time, I still instinctively became defensive, because he also knew. That's the part I keep coming back to. He wasn't some confused, helpless person. He sat through the same legal explanations. He agreed to the same filing process. He watched all 4 children grow up. He saw the payments continue. He had years to address it. And not once did he do anything. No filing, no attorney consultation, no questions, no reminders, nothing. So why did the moral responsibility somehow become entirely mine? That's genuinely what I struggle with. Because people react to this story as though I actively deceived him somehow. But I never lied, never hid paperwork, never forged anything, never manipulated the court. The support orders remained legally active because no modification request was filed. That's literally how the system works. And because I was uncomfortable with the legal side morally, I actually checked with attorneys I worked with at the state office years ago. I wanted to make absolutely sure I wasn't doing anything legally questionable. Every attorney told me the same thing. The payer is responsible for requesting modifications, not the recipient. Legally speaking, I had no obligation to remind him, no obligation to file for him, no obligation to voluntarily reduce payments. And honestly, hearing that reassured me at the time. But apparently, legality and morality are very different conversations. Once his girlfriend reacted so strongly, I started replaying everything differently in my head. Because if I'm brutally honest, part of why I stayed quiet was definitely convenience. The extra money helped. Of course it did. Raising 4 children is expensive, even after they technically become adults. People online act like costs magically disappear at 18. They don't. Groceries, cars, insurance, college support, medical expenses, phones, housing. The financial pressure doesn't instantly vanish the second a birthday happens. So yes, having continued support made life easier. And maybe subconsciously, that influenced my silence more than I wanted to admit. That's the uncomfortable part. Because while I still believe he was responsible for handling his own legal obligations, I also can't fully deny that I benefited from his inaction. And benefiting from someone else's mistake always creates moral gray areas. Still, what frustrates me is how many people immediately leap to words like fraud. That word genuinely annoys me. Fraud implies deception, intentional concealment, illegal misrepresentation. None of that happened. The court order remained active because the required legal steps to change it were never taken. That's not fraud. It may be ethically questionable, it may be selfish, but it wasn't fraud. Honestly, the legal accusations bother me less than the moral ones, because morally, I genuinely don't know anymore. Part of me still feels justified. Another part feels vaguely guilty in hindsight, especially because if the situation were reversed, I honestly don't know how I would have felt. Would I have noticed sooner? Probably. Would I have expected him to remind me? Maybe. Would I have felt betrayed if he stayed silent for years? Possibly. That's what makes this complicated. My ex-husband himself, interestingly enough, never seemed angry. Even after his girlfriend reacted, he mostly just shrugged it off. At one point, he literally said, "Well, I should have filed earlier," which honestly shocked me a little. Because his reaction was so much calmer than everyone else's. Maybe because, unlike outsiders, he actually remembered the original agreement. He knew I handled the first filing exactly like promised. He knew he simply never followed through afterward. And honestly, maybe he also understood something important about our dynamic. Throughout our marriage, I handled endless administrative responsibilities for the family. Paperwork, scheduling, bills, forms, deadlines. The invisible organizational labor women often quietly absorb. And maybe after divorce, I unconsciously decided I wasn't doing that anymore for him. Not maliciously, just done. Still, I can acknowledge now that silence can become its own kind of decision. Every month, I accepted those payments knowing the amount technically could have been lower if he acted. That's true. And maybe morality isn't only about direct responsibility. Maybe sometimes it's also about whether you choose fairness when you have the opportunity. That's the question I keep wrestling with. Because there's a version of this story where I simply remind him after the second child turns 18. He files the paperwork, everything stays perfectly balanced and transparent. And maybe that would have been the kinder thing to do. But there's also a version where people expect women to continue managing men's responsibilities forever because it's emotionally easier. And honestly, I resent that expectation deeply too. I think what makes this situation so divisive is that both things can be partially true at once. Yes, he was legally responsible for filing. Yes, I knowingly benefited from his failure to do so. Yes, I had no legal obligation to help him. And yes, maybe helping him anyway would have been more ethically generous. All of those things can coexist. The internet tends to want one clean villain, one clean victim. But real life rarely works that way, especially after long marriages, especially when decades of shared labor, resentment, parenting, finances, and emotional history all get tangled together. At the end of the day, I don't think I'm some evil mastermind who intentionally scammed my ex-husband. But I also don't think I was purely innocent either. I think I was a divorced woman who stopped feeling responsible for managing her ex-husband's administrative life, while also quietly benefiting from the consequences of his neglect. And honestly, maybe that's not admirable, but it is the truth.